Really excited to have with us here today, John King. All right. He is an educator, and he is going to talk about a history of racial inequities in Philadelphia. His talk will focus on Black Philadelphia in the pre-colonial period, property ownership in 1790, and the history of redlining, including the 1937 map for Philadelphia, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, and redline neighborhoods today. John currently works as the community schools manager for the City of Philadelphia Office of Children and Families. He has worked as an educator for over 20 years, most recently for Germantown Friends School and as an adjunct professor for Pierce College in Temple. He has a bachelor's and master of education from Temple University. He is a native Philadelphian, raised in East Falls, and served honorably in the U.S. Army. Now I will turn it over to John.
Mary Ann, thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I'd like to actually start in a way that's complementary to my culture by asking anyone over 60, an elder, for permission to continue. Thank you, Baba. And thank you all. Okay. So some of this may sound very anecdotal. Okay.
Folks online that they can't understand the audio.
Okay. So should I move it a little further away?
Right. Do a sound check.
Sounds.
Just talk normal.
Talking normal. How you doing? Yeah, I hear that.
Yeah. Ask people on Zoom World if it's better.
Is this better? Can you hear me a little bit better? Better?
No,
Just keep talking.
it's a very
Test,
strong
test,
echo.
test.
Okay, testing. 1, 2,
All
3.
right, go for it. Nobody's
Okay. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, disclaimer, a lot of this may sound anecdotal. There is some research behind it, some method to the madness. Also, as I mentioned when I came in, is a special treat because I brought along an artist, Micah Wilson, who will actually demonstrate in his art the conversation that we're having in terms of some of the racial inequities that Philadelphians face. Okay, so I really wanted to start with talking about what history teachers generally ask, whatever the class grades sometimes. We'll start, if we're doing US history, and I taught US history for a lot of years. I taught it at Temple, I taught it at Pierce, I taught it in grade schools, K through 12. We'll ask something to the effect of who could own property in 1790? And that's important to Philadelphia for a reason that we'll know in a minute.
Ready to start the PowerPoint?
Not just yet.
Perfect.
Thank you. And also, please feel free to chime in and if you have a question, because I want this to be a participatory engagement so that we're all sort of having a conversation at the same time. Anybody know anything about Philadelphia landowners in 1790? No. But good guess. 1790 is the period. That's when the boom begins, right? AME officially is on the books 1815. Although they started the building as early as 1793. Okay. From Richard Allen Atherton Jones, right? Yeah. Okay. What does the stone say? Right. I'm glad you're saying it. 1787 is the actual start of the Free African Society. That's the year they started. I don't believe in, at least the stories that I've been told, was the year that they started to build AME. Because remember, there are a couple of things that happened to force them in that position. talking about racial inequity to want to build the African Methodist Episcopal Church.
And then the thing with James Morton,
Right.
they were probably on the most.
Oh, absolutely. So let me say this, because you're absolutely right. There were some exceptions to the rule, right? But if we're talking about the average Joe and John and Jim and Mary, of them who were able to own property in 1790 in Philadelphia. Okay. So tell me about it. What property did he own?
The land in between 5th Street, 6th Street, Arch Street, and Race Street.
Okay.
Not all of it. No, not all of it.
Do we know the
It
year?
was a neighborhood.
Do we know the period? What's the year? So within that period. Okay. Yes, sir. No, I stand corrected, and thank you for that. Appreciate it. For most people in the colonies at that time, past the colonies in 1790, only wealthy white males were, for the most part, allowed to own property. Women only by way of their husbands, for the most part. Enslaved Africans, of course, we know, for the most part, weren't, but there is an exception to that rule also when we talk about Absalom Jones, right? But for the most part, we're still only talking about white male landowners who also could vote, who also didn't have the history of indentured servitude. So there were clear distinctions between who could own property in Philadelphia and who couldn't. The other thing about 1790 that's important to note is this is the year that our president moves to Philadelphia, right? So you had Washington here, and then John Adams after Washington until 1797. This is the nation's capital. So that actually even puts another layer onto it. But when we talk about specifically, whether we're talking about the Free African Society, that includes Richard Allen, Atherton Jones, the African Lodge, which is centered in Boston at that time by Prince Paul. These were people who were making moves and changing that narrative. Now, who knows the backstory of how AME came to be?
That lodge was for the county at first, where the Celtic stores at today, the Prince Hall.
Right, the Philadelphia version. Right. Right. Now, I'm with you there, but I'm saying in terms of Prince Hall himself, he erected his first African lodges in Boston, right? And he comes to Philadelphia. And I kind of call them, they're like my mighty three, if you know that term in music. The mighty three in Philadelphia is Kenny Gamble, Leon Huff, and Tom Bell, right? Kind of real similar synergy, but different eras, right? Anyway, so who knows the story of why AME needed to be built?
Rusty, I'll be honest, but it was partly because of communion and religious freedom that they could go to the Methodist Church, but either the worship hours were, not with the general congregation, but one of the tipping points was not being able to do it and having to sit up in the hot to look up at the seats and not being able to have an equal participation in worship. It's like, yes, you're letting us hear, but under the eyes of God, we should be equal, and you're not allowing us to have, the Holy Sacrament. And that was kind of the tipping point. Now, I know there are other things, but that's what I was always, I'll be honest, taught was the tipping point. It was really the key.
Thank you so much for that. And most of that is what I've heard also. There's another backstory, though, that I don't know if others have heard, that they were actually in the middle, kneeling, specifically in the middle of prayer, and were pulled up. And Richard Allen's response was, well, can you allow us to can we pray before you throw us out of here? And the response was no. And so from that point, they began to plan. They began to plan to have a place of worship for Black people, or so that we have the nomenclature right also. One of the other things about this particular population in this era is they were clear about who they were. How do we know? They put their names on the building. African, Methodist, Episcopalian, right? African Lodge, not Negro, not colored, not the other N word, not even Black. So there was a real clarity from that particular generation about who they were and where they were going. And so by 1815, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, who's then the bishop, actually have, I don't know the number of the congregants, but the church itself was worth $15,000, $20,000 in 1815 money, which was a pretty daunting task, given where they started, right? The other backstory on Absalom Jones, which is so interesting to me, and it certainly speaks to real estate too, that Absalom Jones, who was in Delaware, was enslaved in Delaware, understood that if he got married and had children, that his children would have to suffer through a period of enslavement. And so what he did was he paid for his intended wife's freedom before his own, so that it would be a guarantee that his children would not be born into servitude. And also for property, because I'm gathering, and this is how we've learned the story. I learned this story maybe 25 years ago in African-American studies at Temple, that some of the enslavers were a bit more congenial and allowed him on his time to be able to make additional money. So he saved up money to buy a property. Not only did he free his wife, but he was a landlord when he was still enslaved, right? Think about the resilience there, right? Very smart, very smart. Yes, sir. I believe it was under Delaware law, yeah, but I will check that. So I wanted to really kind of start there because the stories are so amazing, and unfortunately, for a lot of Philadelphians, African Americans included, when the name Richard Allen is invoked, they think about the housing project that was named in his honor in the 40s, not Mother Bethel, not the legacy that he left, which is really unfortunate.
That African American view, that's Richard Allen.
Right. And what year was he in the first? You schooling me though. I heard the name, but I wasn't quite sure. I've heard part of the story, but I'm not sure of the era that he was actually playing for the Phillies.
It's the last African American in
The lineup? Okay. In the regular league. That's the homework. Yeah. All right, so as I said, some of this will sound a little anecdotal. Let me give you my backstory a little bit. I guess I was just a nerdy kid. Around about high school, 14, I would go to the main library just to visit the microfiche department. I was very curious because my grandparents would always tell these stories. Both of my grandparents are from Eastern Shore, Maryland. We are distantly related to Harriet Tubman, Dorchester County. And so there was always these great stories about when they arrived in Philadelphia in 1944. My grandmother had arrived here from New York. She was a domestic in a lot of the upper middle class Jewish homes in Manhattan. So she learned to cook matzo ball soup, which she gave us on a regular occasion. But again, the richness of the story, she lived to be 91, so I got a lot of stories that I've absorbed. And so when I would go to the library to do my own research, I just would happen to find myself looking not only at real estate property. Remember the other moniker that we had in Philadelphia, we're city and neighborhoods. And so every neighborhood, for those of us old enough, remember there was a neighborhood theater. And so I was always curious, just kind of going through those files, looking at the old bulletin, looking at the old Inquirer Daily News, and seeing not only what the pricing houses were in certain areas, but also looking at what neighborhoods were sort of presented. And it gave me a bit of an idea in terms of who was living there. But also I knew, again, from hearing these stories, my grandparents moved to 13th in York in 1947. And they were one of the first African-American families to be on the block. And so they tell the story of what North Philadelphia looked like in the late 40s. But when you look at the census and when you look at some of the other documents that are available, it really tells that story. The corridor of North Broad Street doesn't become Black Philadelphia until the late 1950s. Right? And to visit there today, people would just assume it was always a Black neighborhood. And it really wasn't, right? So that's the one piece. But the other thing in terms of, well, let me just sort of fast forward. So I wrote a book about 20 years ago, and I was looking for documentation to on certain individuals. And so it led me to Philadelphia School District's library that used to be on the Parkway when the main office was there around 22nd Street. And they had all of the yearbooks. It was like a child. I got to, look through various schools in different neighborhoods, and it told me something. Specifically, I was looking at Germantown High School because that was my neighborhood. That was my high school also. Right, but there's no East Falls High. Yeah, that is Roxborough, but it was a little bit of movement in between elementary school and high school out there. So we moved around a little bit. I'm not telling tall tales, but keep me on my feet. That's good. So anyway, I looked specifically at Germantown, and what was interesting is that when I looked up till 1967, Germantown was pretty much, I would say 90, maybe 80% white. Then when I looked at 69, it was 90% white. What happened in the back? Lock busting, redlining, something else also. Levittown certainly had a little earlier in the 50s was Levittowns that popped up everywhere, right? Something else happened though that was.
White workers had great jobs, jobs got outsourced, and then before the neighborhoods started to be gentrified, as whites moved out, then they started being able to have all of the abandoned houses that they could sell to African Americans in these neighborhoods. Like you're 13 for York, was that before the projects?
Well, 42nd, you tell me.
Right, they're about the same time.
Which project are you referring to?
No, that was the original.
You're talking about the one on
Yorktown.
Yorktown, right? Oh, wait a minute. Yorktown projects or Yorktown development?
But anyway,
Because those who live in Yorktown didn't consider projects. My aunt had a house there. Yeah, those are, are you from
Oxford and Brooklyn?
Okay.
All right, it used to be an all women's African orphanage, right? It was called the Women's Line.
Right.
So I know
All praises. I'm going to defer to you. You were at Broad and Oxford, you know it. No, I was thinking you were talking about, there was a high rise. I'm sorry, let me turn this on. These were low projects.
All right. are developments that are PHA.
Sure,
Or
sure,
they don't have to be high.
sure. Okay.
They don't have to be high rise.
Okay. Right. No, you just told me something because my aunt moved in Yorktown in '58. And she sold that property in maybe '94. Moved back to Maryland, but I never got the idea that they considered those projects. I never got that idea.
And to tell you the real truth,
Mhm.
that's the real area that Bill Cosby was doing his work.
Oh, yeah.
But he had to say Richard Allen project, because everybody knows Richard Allen project.
Right.
You know, and that's where he's going from, that little area out in there.
Sure.
Because a lot of people ended up living in the project, and matter of fact, they live in the Richard Allen project. Right.
Thank you for that. So I don't remember where I was. Oh, 1960, thank you. Right. So all of those things that you all mentioned, absolutely. But the other thing that's even simpler than that was the death of Martin King. So that, my hypothesis is this, that racial incidents, whether we call them conflicts, others call them, we talk about the fourth estate, they call them riots, uprisings, we may call them that. Many of those were used as cover for real estate brokers, certainly for those just interested in keeping a neighborhood in a particular way. They used it as cover to justify not only the bigotry, but also justify keeping people out by the use of redlining. So when you look at that 69 yearbook, it hit me like a shot immediately that this was, because you see it's literally not day and night. 69. I probably, because I wasn't living. I know Frankie's from that area. Raw Soul, right? Yeah.
But they're from that Georgetown prepared.
Right. But you know who was in that book? And I'm trying to remember her name. She replaced Alvin Ailey as the director of Judith Jamison. Thank you. Judith Jamison was in that yearbook.
Because also they were in literature that will not show you any problem in any different other area.
Right.
And that way, like for example, where I live, I was one of the first African Americans in my neighborhood. Matter of fact, I was the first on the block. And everybody was like, oh, they're looking at neighborhood. Right, because we have to be here. We're gonna have a problem with all the folks. But they don't even know I live there because I'm so quiet. But now they did down. In the Northeast.
Northeast.
Still great, but it's in the regentrification and the redlining, and some of them won't even show you property in some different areas, even though you have the money for that property.
Sure.
And therefore they keep you where they want to keep you.
Absolutely.
All right, because
Absolutely.
my first property I bought was in West Plain, where I wouldn't want to live in the Northeast. And I was going to shoot the property in the Northeast. So I bought property in West Plain, which got regentrified because the area was so great with recreation activity for all of the kids, brand new schools.
Oh, Chuck Northeast.
No, we're talking, Martin Luther King, 1972, was then built.
1970. 70.
Okay, all right, and everywhere you went, there was recreation for your children. All right, which was fantastic, all right, in that area, but it made it with all African Americans. And then the crack addict came. And then the children could go out and play anymore. And all of these great, you got the swimming pool, behind King, Albury Park, yeah, Simonville, you got the ice skating rink right there. I mean, everything. But it wasn't built for the Africans to enjoy at first until things changed, jobs, all that. Most of the whites moved out of the area.
Right. That was a pretty that whole Northwest corridor was pretty Jewish before black folks came. Right, and those Jewish Americans began to move into Montgomery County, Alphonse Park, and so forth, Jenkintown and so forth.
I got one.
Sure.
But so from 1967 was 90% white, 1969 was 90% black, and in between them, Martin Luther King. But how did, I'm confused how that switch happened in 2 years.
Sure.
Oh,
It is really, it was white flight, essentially. I believe the realtors were giving them a particular narrative, you know. Again, I'm referring to the fourth estate journalists. You know, when you look at, and that's the other thing that I looked at when I went back to library, microfiche, and looking at metro sections and common opinions in the bulletin and other newspapers. And what I found was a lot of vitriol over some of the things that were being perceived as racial aggression, racial violence in the form of how the journalists who were writing at that time was writing. And so my hypothesis is this, is that those stories helped the real estate brokers and agents to sell that fear. And we see it certainly in the change over that 2-year period. I don't believe that those families moved far. I believe they may not even have moved at that time, but they certainly changed schools. You know, there was Germantown, France, to which I taught for 4 years. There were other schools that they could send their kids to get them out of the public school of Germantown. And I think that worked around the city for different, you know, under different racial incidents. Yes, sir.
Did you ever hear of a man named Sam Evans do a credit party?
Oh, of course.
I think that he takes a lot of credit for what he called neighborhood breaking, Mount Airy, West Oak Lane. He worked very, very hard on those kinds of things. And I think it might be a little bit of simplification if you say they just moved in 1 year. You know, because Sam Evans and those guys working on that in the 50s, went right into the 70s. You know.
Sure, I certainly don't want to take away what folks who were advocating for diverse neighborhoods, diversity, to suggest that somehow this was just one-sided. They were pushing hard. Sam Evans was in the House, Pennsylvania House, I believe, for a long time. Lived to be close to 100, right?
Yeah, one of my teachers, just being Devon, to read a meeting one day, like an audience.
Mm-hmm. Great dude.
Like he was Godfather.
He was in a lot of ways. Yes, sir.
Look it up.
Forgot about that factor, right? The Rizzo factor. And I don't know if it tells you this, Jazz, but Rizzo, I don't know if it was from the time that he was police commissioner or when he became mayor in 71 that he moves to Chestnut Hill, right? And that area, we felt his presence. I lived there in the 90s. His wife, Carmela, was still there. And so there was always a strong police presence, and we kind of remember specifically on his block. Right. Yes, sir.
Back to 1791, George Washington law, the Fugitive Slave Act law.
Okay.
For example, we do Queen Village in South Philly. When after the 1791 Fugitive Slave Act law turned law 1793,
In
enacted in the 1800s.
Right.
Africans left all their properties. Because if they didn't, they would go back to slavery. Like we have what's called the head house here in Philadelphia. The real story of that is where Africans used to buy and sell their goods at a head house. In Queen Village, they're finding artifacts in the ground to show that there were African cemeteries.
Right.
You know, so the Africans had to leave property, not to mention there was riots that burned down a lot of their property that they could find. Some of the famous people they couldn't find their house
Sure.
So there was the absolute no, that's still very important. But the other thing is African leaders, they burned down their property
Right.
and others were in fear. So Africans just left all their property, which is now $1 million houses today in South Philly. All right, and then there's the push where that's where they were starting, right off of the river, got pushed westward toward, further toward Bullard Street. Then across Bullard Street, we had the first African hospital, African medical school, the Douglas and the Mercy.
Frederick Douglass.
It was emerged within Africa
Right.
after a while. So there were pushbacks, but there were also laws against Africans to just stay in the society, let alone try to own property. You know, because they tell you don't let Hollywood educate you. All right, Hollywood's not educating people anymore. Everybody's got podcasts and all of this now. And in the Harriet movie, you'll see James, William Still.
Right.
They're telling all the Africans, you gotta leave Philly.
Right.
All right, because if you leave your property, go to Canada. So now you got all these abandoned lands where all of the immigrants are coming in and just take over. I'm German, all right, I'm Polish. I'm abandoned house. Nobody. So this is how Africans lost a lot of their property and you can't come back. All right, but when you do come back, you don't have to take a bill of sale or anything of what you own during that time period. So that's like, it's not redlining, but it's the laws against Africans, not only to stay here, or to own property.
Right.
So only the famous leaders stay. Like Richard Allen was witness slavery. Anybody ever been to the basement?
I'm sorry, I just wanted to do a quick time check, because it's 20 of 8, and we haven't even started on your PowerPoint.
So yeah, can we put that on? I know this. Sure. I haven't gotten there yet, bro. Can you give me a second? Because I actually knew Charles Blockson. I went to Temple. I taught at Temple. Right? So I know what you're talking about. I didn't, and let me tell you this, why I didn't mention the Fugitive Slave Act, and it's certainly important. But it's harder to, because a lot of that information has been sort of written off. No one's really covering the who, and that we know that there were a lot of Africans, not only here, but all over the country that were losing their property because of 1793 and 1850, right? We know the whole piece from 12 Years a Slave, even in terms of reading that book. But also, I really wanted to kind of get closer to the modern period because I think it tells the story in terms of redlining, the codifying of that a little bit better. But I did want to also mention, really important book is Du Bois's The Philadelphia Negro. So we know that when Du Bois came to Philly postdoctoral, right, from Harvard in, I believe, around 1897, 1898. And he does this hefty research on the 7th Ward specifically, because to your point, there was moving of Africans away from, not only from the docks, but away from other areas of Philadelphia. But the irony is, when you look at South Philly specifically, at 7th Ward, some of the most expensive real estate today, right, is where Africans found themselves, right? And so when we of course, we talked about AME, but there's a family called the Cassies, and there's a marker, historical marker for them right on 4th Street, Joseph and Amy Cassie, right? Not only were they real estate people, but they were intellectuals. So they would host events for those in that African community and would show them not only how to complete and secure freedom, because it wasn't complete, but also to become entrepreneurs. And so there was a lot of movement in what we now consider to be Old City and South Philadelphia of African people at that time, which is really interesting. And it really feeds to what happens in the 20th century. The 20th century is where we can see it all. It was much difficult to really put your finger on all of it in the 19th century and 18th century because the enslavers and the quick buck artists were smart enough not to record all of that, you know, for our purview. But when you look at the neighborhoods, I'd say leading from the 1930s specifically, that red map, I'm sorry.
Want me to start your PowerPoint?
Yes. I'm only going to talk for about 5 more minutes because I want to give Mr. Wilson some time. We can skip over my stuff.
Yes, one more.
One more. One more. One more. One more. Perfect. So this gives me the history of redlining. Right. And a lot of this information, I like to always tell where I got some of this, comes from our own Rebecca Reinhardt, who did I think, an awesome job in pulling up a lot of this information. Now, some say she had a political agenda, right? You know, she's running for mayor. So maybe that was the agenda. But I think she also wanted to expose the connection that is still occurring. You know, that we have Point Breeze now called Newbold, right? For the gentrifiers. So a lot of this stuff is still going on. Some of you guys may remember an old group called the Intruders. Right? What neighborhood did they speak about in their song? I always love my mom. Tenderloin. Where Tenderloin was? Yes, yes. Right, we're kind of where Ben Franklin, where it meets, right? Yeah. And so Skid Row is what some of them called it at that time, right? But that was a heavily neighborhood, much like South Street was, or the side of South Street that was at least important to the hippies when they met, right? So she really delves into, not only in terms of the mapping, in terms of looking at what neighborhoods were coded as dangerous, impoverished. So they were different codes, and the realtors used those codes handily, and they really kind of kept us separate. I remember coming all the way when I left Germantown High School to 7th and Chestnut to go to school. I was going to a private high school here, and it was an interesting interaction because it was South Philadelphians here and other folks from different parts of the neighborhood, but I could tell that there was almost a standoffish sort of posture about Black males. Still is, right? But she really, and I would love for you all to kind of go through. We don't have the time tonight to go through every piece of it, but the mapping really tells the story of why in a city like Philadelphia, where the houses are almost identical, that you have different rates in terms of property. Some of the old North Philly mansions are selling for at 10% of what's selling in South Philadelphia for a 3-bedroom, 1-bath, right? These are interesting contrasts that I don't know if most Philadelphians pay attention to. Now, we have a tax rate hike for those of us who own property in Philadelphia. Right, well, I don't know if it's much of it's abatement. I know it's a hike. Say again? Right. I guess the point that I'm making with all of this is that Philadelphia hasn't changed that much. Only thing that's changed is the numbers, that for 20 years, Black folk have been the majority of the city. White folks' numbers have still dropped. Now is at 39%. And we're not that far away. We're about maybe 43%. of the population than everybody else is in the city. But you would imagine for what we call a chocolate city, like we call it Washington, D.C. and Detroit and Atlanta, that there would be a better spacing or better opportunities for those who are the majority in the city, as there always been. You know, when I was a kid here, we had 2 billion people in Philadelphia in 1970. You know, we've steadily dropped. We're down to 1.5 million now. Yet we are the most impoverished big city in the country. We're the 2nd largest city on the East Coast, yet we're the most impoverished. And when you look at the housing prices of New York, DC, Boston, with the exception of Baltimore, we're really a pretty reasonably priced city in terms of housing. But that's the only thing that we can say in the positive. So what I wanted to showcase, because I really believe these particular incidents, and I'm going to call them out, and I'd like Mr. Wilson, Micah, to come up and show his works. He did a dynamite job. Specifically, and people forget this, Philadelphia was the 2nd city to have what I call an uprising, what journalists called a riot, August of '64. August of '64, y'all remember that? Columbia Avenue. You got it.
Woman called my woman by the police. She's a little we get out of the bar, and then it started an uprising.
And the rumor was that the police shot a pregnant woman, right? So you had that. Of course, we talked about King, 1970 with the Black Panther Party and Rizzo marching them down the street in the underwear. Yes, sir.
Right.
And we haven't even gotten to the 80s yet, right? Or you know, 78, Carlton Village.
But that was also
Mhm.
and that's what blame
Right,
That's the guy who found how to do that right here on the park.
Von Collins, right. That's Southwest Philly, right?
No, well, I was
No, where's his memorial?
think that the officer bottom.
Great, Von Collins. Got you. Thank you. Thanks for that clarification. The so also on the positive of this, there's a picture of Falaka Fatah, Shaka Fatah's mother, who opened the House of Umoja, if you all remember that. Of course, you got the 85 Move incident. And so again, my hypothesis has been that these racial conflicts actually sold the idea and submitted it of redlining even beyond the legal, the de jure version of redlining. That it continues on because of our mindset and our thinking of specifically Black people in this city. I want to give the mic to Mr. Wilson. If anybody has any questions, I'll hold the photo. Okay.
I just want to greet you all in love. I just want to say I'm just blown away by the discussion and how much knowledge is just sitting in this space. I hope it continues, not in just the exchange between generations that are represented here, but something that could continue, as we all should be lifetime learners and passing this on to our children and those that are not yet born. Thank you, Mr. King, for the honor just to support this discussion. Just allowing an aesthetic, hopefully, to speak for itself. But when they can't, I just have a few words to share. Who knew moving on up wasn't away from Southern segregation? Redlining under the North Star as it shines as a thought bubble of heaven, a free society of Africans, even in the access of paradise, salvation still presents discrimination. As I look up to the drinking gourd, freedom's on my mind, a knee is on my neck. Kanye, don't tell me it's not there. Fossil prints of a dog bites on my leg. As water drenches my clothes, skin falls from my limbs like bark from a tree. Strange fruit, an anti-Semitic fate intersecting genocide, at a historical and alarming rate, prison pipelines under concrete. As I look up to Mother Earth, I admire her son. Each day we see her beloved sun rise and set, some to rise no more. Mama Fatah dreams deferred. As automatic guns ring and gangs bang, may the house of Ujima rise again. UNITY, UNITY, that's a unity. Moving on, a bomb rang. Look up in the sky, not a bird nor a plane. Broken homes everywhere, chalk lines of divine spirits that can't breathe. And no one cares. It's a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under, Destroy the aesthetics of oppression by any medium necessary. As Nomad's graffiti metanetta affirms, Black is beautiful. So just supporting the discussion this evening about some historical happenings, past and present. I really want to call out to one of the smallest illustrations in our corner, which is in Kensington. If you all don't know, I have not been through that space. I think it is a great collision of redlining meets poverty, meets all other isms that we might have discussed indirectly or collaboratively tonight. And my greatest prayers for humanity, as I speak about Black being beautiful, Black is a color that engulfs many. And our hope is our connection in humanity that allows us to set a foundation to move forward. As we've seen different pivots in neighborhoods, Northern Liberties, I don't know when that was created, a brewery town, and other separations of connected communities. I really do pray that even though it was intentional, strategic, and supported by policy and legislation, that the works that we're doing in our families and those that we love extend past any strategic plan. So again, Mr. King, I'm honored to be able to support you in this aesthetic. And thank you all, as my heart is full and my mind is full as well from all the information I've been able to learn this evening. My name is Emily Ohm. As an artist, Micah Wilson, I'm an educator here in Philadelphia. I want to give a shout out to Malia and Ashley, who are my cohort members of Surge Philadelphia, as we hope to uphold some of the changes, movement, or revolution for the greater good here in the city of Philadelphia. So you all's destination back home, be safe, be blessed. And again, thank you for this time.
About how communities differentiate themselves.
Yes.
And so I moved here 2 years ago and I thought I was living in Fishtown, and everybody said, from Fishtown, we're like, nope, you don't live in Fishtown.
Right.
And so I learned that they called it East Kensington. And I'm like, you know what, I don't really care, like, but I feel disingenuous if I say I live in Kensington, because then it's like, oh, look, you know, white girl lives in like Kensington, right? Comes off as a little presumptuous, right? Like I live in Kensington. I know those neighborhoods. I live right by Lehigh and Kensington, right? Like I'm not Allegheny in Kensington, but I'm close enough. And so what are your thoughts on people who like presume to be part of a community? Because me saying I'm from Kensington, I feel is presumption. It's not my story. It's not my history. It's not my struggle. But I don't also want to utter myself and be like, oh, I'm not from that Kensington. I'm from East Kensington. So kind of what's your feelings on that? Like as like white people start to integrate around communities, or is our communities becoming more diverse, not necessarily just white and Black? Like when is it us and when can we be us? Do you hear what I'm saying?
I do.
Okay.
I
Or you
will,
can think about it and get back to me.
I will speak for myself.
Please.
I honestly don't care. No, and respectfully, as names have changed so many times, The problems have not really changed in regards to area codes, etc. And what I would also encourage you, don't even worry about that. I appreciate you being mindful of how you present yourself, how you will be interpreted. But nevertheless, it's not about where you're from. It's about your heart and what you do. I was born in West Philadelphia. I lived in Lansdowne, Pennsylvania, the majority of my life, where I also experienced being one of the first Blacks on the community. I remember in Upper Darby, where I lived in kindergarten, being chased and called nigger and a knife being pulled out on me in kindergarten. This was not by police. This was not Black on Black violence. This was just a culture shock on two sides and not knowing how to communicate. Yeah, so I come back to this community where I've been working and serving for over 13 years, and people question how valid I am in being a Philadelphian. But I say, look at my work and not my address. As my grandmother came up from slavery and passed away January 4th at the age of 100, if you asked her where she's from, she would not say Philadelphia. If you asked her ancestors where they were from, they wouldn't say South Carolina, and continue on down the line. So thankful that you sit where you are and you are as mindful. But I ask where you live that we just continue this work to do the best that we can, to be examples and not just continual extensions of trauma and oppression.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
Another question. Sorry, I didn't see a hand. No, you go.
Well, here, in the context of the discussion being about housing and neighborhood and the trauma, I think it's important for people to realize when they're immigrants and when they're neighbors. Because of the issues, especially those of us who are going to be doing historical narrative. It's important to be able to present the historical narrative in some kind of real fashion, because it isn't about our personal interaction, right? Even as some of these neighborhoods change, you can say they are relatives. I'm looking at, across the Crosstown Expressway, which is a major part of why South Philly changed, and why, what is Society Hill, and even into Mother Bethel, why it almost got lost, right, compared to St. Thomas. So if we do the kumbaya and not really be able to express the dynamics, we're doing a disservice to the historical narrative. And I think as we accept the historical narrative personally, then we can interact differently personally in how we either can be able to change it or recognize what we're a part of in that displacement of those who are moving, because there is considerations, whether you call it by whites or you call it by gentrifiers, there are considerations by others, planning commission, the realtors, the developers, that makes this thing happen. So that's, because I know people, we make it personal, we forget. And right now, our role is to be about memory, not necessarily about how we feel.
Excellent, thank you. That's really powerful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would just add to that, quote that favorite professor of mine, Temple, would always say, that public opinion shapes public policy. And so the very people that we
have distaste for, we tend to create policy that doesn't favor them, right? Real simple. I mean, but it's something that always kind of stayed with me. I really appreciate what you said. Absolutely. Yes, sir.
So a number of years ago, maybe about 20, 25 years ago, United Bank was established. And
Ms. Chappelle.
right, and it was intended specifically to provide mortgages for Black families to move wherever they wanted to.
Right.
And for one reason or another, I get the details, but it no longer exists as far as I know. But, well, it's still, oh, it's still done? Okay. I didn't know that. But, so to what extent is redlining still happening? And is it just more subtle, or is it just that I'm not aware of it? Or obviously I'm not aware of the bank, so that might be the answer. And are there things that we should be looking at to make us question what's going on in my neighborhood or in other neighborhoods?
Thank you so much for that. Absolutely. One of the things that we're seeing, which really sort of parodies what's happening in the medical community, that you may have, and let me just give you this example. You have upper middle class professional Black women who are dying at a disturbing rate from breast cancer, seeing some of the best physicians in the city or whatever city they may be in. Something very similar is happening in real estate, that you have professional Black folk who have a credit score that's bigger than 640 or 680 and are being turned down, or they're overly scrutinizing the application. I know it personally, but I also know it having talked to a lot of folks from different cities, because we've talked about some of these things that are happening in terms of the banks, that FICO score is not good enough. My work history all of a sudden isn't good enough. Now you need my mama's number, right, as a reference. I'm 55, and really? And so that's some of the stuff that sort of creeped in to the application process for a lot of Black folks, and it makes us very frustrated because we know we have the basic criteria, but we're not getting the spaces that we're actually applying for in a lot of instances. Right. Where are we?
So, short question, long question. Short
Okay.
question, we've got a few more slides, so let me know when you
Oh,
want those.
sure.
Because we stepped out when we talked about our long question. So these are all topics that we get asked, or at least I can't speak for everyone in the room, but I get asked on one. And I try to use language to explain it, to explain the history, why certain neighborhoods have changed. I talk about, the changing of Society Hill, how it went to the board, Society Hill, and, the border in Queen Village, and a lot of those topics. But I also get asked relating to a lot of the media portrayal of what's happening in Philadelphia. I'm being very clear to say media, because I do feel like I have guests from Chicago, and they'll say, oh, I had somebody show up on tour armed, but then they said they felt safer in this city. So do you have any advice or insight? I mean, I'm doing my own work and my own research, but kind of helpful, because I want to make sure that I am explaining it, because we are ambassadors of the city.
Sure.
And this is a city I'm proud of, warts and all. And that's part of our history. If you're not reading history and you're not getting mad and pissed off occasionally, then you're not reading history.
Right. Absolutely.
You're reading Disneyland.
Right. Fantasy Island. I would just add this, if it hopefully it's helpful.
Yeah.
I taught at Temple University for 15 years. My favorite question to students is, why are you here? Why did your parents choose to send you here? Why did you choose to send you here? And they would always have commentary about their parents. Well, I like Temple, but my parents feel that the neighborhood is unsafe. And so it's a lot of cold words, right? I would always respond with something that was researched. And I would say to students often, don't you know that most crime is intraracial and not interracial? I mean, we can look at 48 hours, snaps, Dateline on any day.
True crime, white man going after a woman, white woman,
Right.
all the serial killers.
Right.
Specials.
And so most of the crime that people like to ascribe to Philadelphians really don't happen to them. And most of, this sounds very racist, I apologize. Most African Americans know this in Philadelphia that they can't walk everywhere and be safe. I think it's opposite for most European Americans though. I don't ever see anybody having a struggle going through the neighborhoods that I've been in. I've been ran out of Port Richmond too many times to count.
And that's a great example. Some ways that some of me and my friends know if a neighborhood is like going through the process of changing is if you will see somebody walking their dog at a certain time of the day when it's just like, what are you doing? You know what I mean? I don't want to add deeper insult to injury. There's real issues going on in the city of Philadelphia. We've talked about a lot of different things that really deal with like social economics. And redlining to me is that when people talk about like crabs in a barrel, that redlining makes it a little bit tighter, right? So if you have a group of people, regardless of race, that have historical trauma, inequity in regards to employment, great achievement gaps academically and raises and funding and employment, mental health from it, again, not having certain resources to deal with it, certain traditions that are passed down, how to handle it, may become somewhat abusive to self and or community, again, regardless of race, right? There are certain things that once people become successful, regardless of any group or immigrant group that's come here, you've all started from humble and or questionable beginnings. That questionable in regards to things that may have that are illegal, right? There is a pocket that I would just call out explicitly that here in when we talk about Mama Fatah, she was significant due to her proactiveness in regards to gang violence. Gangs are not even associated with the East Coast if you're not talking about mobs. In North Philly right now, there are two gangs that are at odds, the Black Bandanas and the Zoo Gang. I have no idea about these gangs. I've lived on 22nd and Woodstock where that conflict is going on. I've aged out. But my students share with me how uncomfortable it is for them walking from one place to the other, doing DoorDash on their bicycle, and them feeling unsafe riding around that area. Also between that 17th to about 23rd, there is a high tempo community. There are apartments going up all the time that people that are moving in and don't live in that space may not know about what's going on. Or those like myself that don't live in North Philadelphia, but may live in West Philly, don't know what's going on either. So I share that example in regards to, I want to encourage you, of course, always know your surroundings. But my reflection back to those that are involved in these gangs, and I thank you, brother, for what you shared in regards to the history of knowing it so it's not forgotten. And being a transplant, making sure that you give honor of those that came before you. My question then to all those young people that are part of this social conflict is in regards to their ownership, in regards to the community that they have. I'm not just talking about address, I'm not just talking about your mom's dad lived in this space. In regards to the responsibility that you have in regards to the positive and or negative things that are occurring in the community. Outside of us understanding what got us here, I really want us to focus on what we actually can do to change the conflicts that are happening in our communities. Or connected communities. I say that because it may sound good saying it, but our communities are not connected in regards to resources, in regards to who you may know, even in regards to how you may embrace somebody. So, and that's been going on from when my father, growing up in Southwest, he had to deal with the Moon Gang, right? And now our students that live in North Philly have to deal with the Black Bandanas. And why were those gangs created now are completely different than why those gangs were created then. And again, we talk about social economics, oppression, racism, opportunity. And what those gangs attempted to do was to protect said community, was to take on some sense of ownership. Again, when limited resources occur, people will become, it's the survival of the fittest. So I'm saying a lot. I don't mean to condone any behavior that may hurt others. I just don't want us to hang our hats strictly on history and not be present about what's still going on today and what's been going on in regards to movement. Because there are some historically Black communities that at one time were historically not. You know what I mean? So us to dig so deep into the soil can make sense in regards to exchange of information. But my greatest hope is us hopefully being able to come together again. How can we connect resources? How can, regards of race, religion, can we be and do more in the communities that we may live 5, 20, 30 minutes, hour away? We moved away due to, we know the climate is something that we do not want to raise our children in, right? Because imagine someone that lives in your community that wants to move out, being, I guess you would say, a native, and want to move out of that space due to the majority of those that you may see in that area are white but don't live in that. Have any of you all ever caught the L Market line from the Kensington area all the way down to 69th Street? What a horrible ride. There are so many people that are in that K&A area that don't even live in that area. However, the children, those families that live there that don't use or do drugs at all, are being exposed to said abuse. And the majority of those that they're seeing are white in those spaces. And the community that's made up was historically white and now Latinx, right? And again, similar to what we talked about, when properties are abandoned or lower, you have those squatter laws, and we have people that may move into those spaces to take up a home. Full stop. That is again nothing new, but something that is greater than the magnitude that we've seen historically. And that space being the biggest area nationally. Even though the face of crime in Philadelphia is Black, the biggest drug issue.
Any other questions, sir?
First, I'd like to thank you all and commend you all for bringing such a wonderful discussion to the group.
Thank you for inviting us.
I missed part of it, and I'm sorry about that. But I was wanting to get some feeling from you guys about, Philadelphia itself. We say, well, history is not that important, but maybe the history of gangs in Philadelphia is that important. Maybe the history of riots in Philadelphia is that important. And if you look at the beginnings around 1804 at the Independence Square, when people were rioting against Black people because they came to celebrate the 4th of July, that's kind of like an origin thing. It also happened in Boston too. And those gangs propagated and grew and grew and grew till they almost controlled the city. Some say they did control the city. So this neighborhood thing, is this really something that's developed out of our own self-hatred? This Philadelphia tradition, it goes on and on, neighborhood against neighborhood. They call themselves defenders. Maybe they're not really defenders, maybe they're aggressors. So just want to hear your feelings about that. Is that something that's ingrained in us in Philadelphia as a community? That's something that's kind of new.
I'll give you a quick response. Because I'm really interested in that, in the whole gang culture. I'm old enough to remember 1974. Height of gang warfare, right? The height, it was the height. Highest number of deaths attributed to gangs was in 74. 74, 75. Well, again, we're talking about recorded information. The problem with that, not that it's a problem, is that that hasn't been recorded properly. We know that in 1870, certainly with Cotto, right, that there was a lot of Irish gang fare, right?
They turned down the street,
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Problem is they don't have the number count. And so when I'm using 74, I'm only using it in terms of what was written. And I apologize for that. But you're absolutely right that when you look at the period specifically from 1825 until that period. Not only Philadelphia, New York, almost every other year, there was a riot against African people, against their presence. Election day as well. Right, absolutely. Right. But to your question, has that become a Philadelphia tradition? I think it has, because when you look at the early part of the 20th century, whether they were K&A or the Italians coming in, every group felt the need to protect their earth, their community, right? You know, that's where the moniker lived and stayed. And it morphed somehow into more of a criminal piece at some point than it was about protecting the neighborhood. Where that fell off, we don't know. But it's certainly been embedded in the culture. What Mr. Wilson was describing, and I so appreciate it with Sister Falaka Fatah, for those of us who remember that there were a lot of neighborhoods who had made truce, right? There was a truce in South Philly, specifically 20th and Carpenter, 280, 28th and Oxford, uptown where we were in terms of what we call Brickyard and Somerville and all those places. They were no longer fighting. The only fights were in West Philly at a particular time, towards as we head up towards the late 70s. So then you have Sister Fatah creating the House of Umoja, and it changed things. It died in Philly. And it only has resurfaced, I think, with the popularity of what we see on the West Coast. No, am I wrong? Why did it resurface?
First of all, it started with propaganda.
Okay.
All right. I grew up in the game. My nickname is Slingshot. My brother was shot. We were 15B.
15B?
Yeah, 15 River Name.
Okay.
All right, we're checking it. 19 Butler, 238, 23 Atlantic,
Right.
all the other games. All right. They kind of work.
Sure.
But how they started, they were watching TV and looking at the Untouchable.
Okay.
Oh, you two don't know that?
Of course not. Frank Nitty, are you kidding? Right.
Untouchable. Now, when Sister when she came out with Alfred Motion and Quilt Them Down.
Right.
But then it started up again when the movie came out and the JDM came into Philadelphia.
Yes, mid-80s.
Right, but the old lady came, they faded out because of the House of Emotion, and then the propaganda came in where you started watching Tupac and all these other guys on TV that were gangsters and all, and then the young boys want to be gangsters all over again.
Right. Well, you make my point. What I'm saying is that it morphed into a criminal element, right?
Because I was nephew that was part of the JDM that served her. And he's out now and he's straight and narrow. Won't go near anything or anything. And I told him the one that live in Philly no more. All right. And they're from the Richard Allen Projects, when they made everybody get out. Redid the Richard Allen Project and only put the good people back in Richard Allen Projects. So the propaganda that the kids were looking at is what drove them to want to be gangsters. They didn't own nothing. They weren't really protecting the neighborhood. They were calling it their neighborhood, but they weren't protecting the neighborhood. You know, and him dealing with prison. Now I grew up in prison, and I'm gonna tell you, he is also one of the reasons why we don't have gangs, because he enforced the loitering law. Right. If you got 12 young teenagers on the corner, think about what they gonna do. They pull up and say, 3 y'all go that way, 3 y'all go that way, 3 y'all go that way. And if you say one word, I'm gonna fall. Everybody disperse. We had cell phones. All right, we say, yo, man, let's go meet up again. And they couldn't meet back up again. And it started discouraging the gangs. Well, this didn't go for that Gordon area.
Sure.
That area right there. But that's what fluid right now. Because I shipped to New York. But my way got home by a gang with a flagpole off of Michigan Avenue, further apart. Unsolved word. But I'm living in New York. Right. I got lucky because I grew up in the deep state area. All right, and I went to the richest prep school in this country, at the first African. But it was a racial situation out of the grass. You know what they say, grass is for the rats?
Were you there when Marcus Foster was there?
When the women ran the show and put it up there, everything was great. Politicians made it over, everything went downhill.
But you know, we're putting these socioeconomic realities is that all those parents, there were more parents that was raising children who weren't engaged.
Right.
Right? Who were under economic desperation and was figuring out how do they raise their children so that they won't get. And when we tell our narrative, I think it's important to accentuate that because that population is bigger and what they did, the struggle of how they tried, and they had, and in certain points, they had 8 children, 10 children, right? Right. And they, all of those children didn't grow up to be criminals. So it was something that they were doing, that network, that kinship, that from the 1800s, from the 1700s, because that relationship is historical of how you, in this hostile environment, that, and you're dealing with legal resources, do you bring up and protect your children? Church, right? I mean, that story is a counterbalance when we're talking about a narrative. And we're talking about people coming in who are, you know, visiting. I think that that's important to understand, especially as we're dealing with the narrative of the different communities. And that's all communities.
You know, let's stop for a second because we're getting there at 8:30 unless we'll have to leave. Want to get the APT announcements quick, and anybody who wants to stay and continue the discussion, if you've got the willing to stay as well.
Would you use the mic so the virtual people can get
But
it?
to be honest, I think yes.
They're still on.
You guys are still hanging in Zoom. Good job. I have 3 people still hanging in. All right, so I just said we were going to just stop for a second to give the APT announcements because some people will have to leave at 8:30. So I just want to make sure we do that. And then if anyone wants to stay and chat with these guys more, if they're willing to stay, then we can do that. So of course, the big news is Saturday, the Philly Forward, a tourism symposium. This Saturday, doors open at 8:30. So if you're registered, if you're not registered, we still have, I think, 5 tickets now that are from sponsors that opened up. So go online to the APT store that's open again. So if you want to buy an in-person ticket or a Zoom ticket, and we're also recording the Zoom and we'll send the link out after the event. So if you can't attend Saturday, you can still pay for the Zoom and then we'll send you the link and you can watch it afterwards at your convenience. But doors open at 8:30. We're going to have breakfast, snacks, coffee, and then we have lunch recommendations for you. You're on your own for lunch. And then we'll come back and we have a really great closing reception planned. And all the speakers are great. I've talked about that before. You've had emails, you know, tons and tons of emails about it. But the closing reception is going to be really great. We have a lot of food donations with different vegan vendors, really cool chefs in the city, and some vegetarian. So, and even the new Georgian vendor from Reading Terminal Market, which I'm super excited about. So yeah, so hope you'll join us Saturday. And I don't even know what else is after Saturday. That's all I've been thinking about. And we're having a cake, Frank Furness's birthday cake. We have a beautiful cake plan. He's turning 183. I got big 183 balloons. So we're very excited. He's turning 183, Frank Furness, the architect of the church where we're having it. Yeah. He'll be there in spirit. And the following Friday, which I think is the 18th, we're going to do a tour of First Unitarian Church. So if you're coming to the event, or even if you don't, if you want to come to the tour the Friday afterwards and just hear about this great building that we're going to be in all day Saturday. So Richard Fry, some of you may remember, has been a member in the past. He's going to lead the tour that Friday. And I don't know, Mike, do we have anything else for November or December? I don't think so. Our December meeting, second Wednesday, will be the holiday party. So we're going to get the people downstairs are going to make us a little buffet to have for our holiday party. So that's a treat from us, from the board for you guys. And Ned Drinker is going to talk a little about his family and the upcoming book club and his initiative to get a Drinker Alley renamed. What's it now? Quarry Street, I think. I think it's called Quarry Street now. He wants to have it renamed Drinker Alley like it used to be back in the day. So he'll talk about that at the December meeting, and then we'll just have social time and food and hang out. So, and the book club in December will be, I actually have it in my bag. It's a like an abbreviated version, although it's like this thick, of Elizabeth Drinker's journals. And Ned's going to lead the book club. And Elizabeth Drinker is Ned Drinker's like great whatever grandmother, some 4 or 5 greats grandmother. That's the 3rd Tuesday. I don't remember the date off the top of my head. Rob. Oh, thank you. Yeah. You want me to say it? Okay, so December 3rd, Rob is telling me here, is the Deck the Alley at Alfred's Alley. They need volunteers. So email Judy or me, and we can put you in touch with them if you'd like to volunteer. It's really great to volunteer because you get to stand in the house and pretend it's your house. I'm always channeling my future house when I'm standing there. But you get to meet the owners, and then you get to go in the bathroom and go downstairs in the basement sometimes. So you get a little more behind the scenes than the regular people who go. But it's a really fun event. So I highly recommend, even if you don't volunteer, go checking it out. December 3rd. Yeah, it's if you don't know, they kind of people open their homes and you get to tour the downstairs of people's homes on Alfred's Alley. And it's what, $25 or it'll be $25. So you could do that. But if you're volunteer, then it's free. And then when you're done with your shift, you get to go around and do it all for free. It's very cool. Usually, yeah, there'll be carolers and hot chocolate, and yeah, it's really fun. I mean, I've always enjoyed it when I do it. Anything else? Any other announcements?
Just thank you all
All
for
right.
being things for the hybrid meetings. This is a test run for the symposium. So thank you for that. And it's gone great. You all did a fabulous job. Very well done. So thank you for putting it on airplane mode. Yes.
So if any of you want, I don't know if any of you want to stay or want to come chat with these guys, have any last questions? Sorry, Josh, I cut you off. So if you want to come ask your question.
I'm going to see you. You can see quite a few people online.